Q&A time again, where we answer all your frequently asked orchid growing questions. Well, your Phalaenopsis or moth orchid growing questions anyway, because a lot of beginners see this as being an orchid. And where a lot of beginners struggle at the start is because they don't understand the basics. And today we're going to outline all of those basics through answering these questions. And if you want more detail on any of this information, remember Ed has posted up a huge resource of articles in an easy to follow format in that Buy Me a Coffee link. And that can be your go-to for all your orchid growing needs. And in this video, I'll also probably be referring back to other videos we've done covering topics on Phalaenopsis, because some of the topics are a whole discussion in of themselves. And the magic clipboard to keep me on track says the most frequently asked Phalaenopsis questions are general care questions, feeding, repotting, flowering, blooming, and of course, health and problems. So let's go through each topic and get all your answers that you're looking for. In the general care of Phalaenopsis, the most frequently asked questions is, how often should I water my orchid? This is actually quite a trick question. It's basically asking how long is a piece of string, because there's all sorts of things that go into this, like your climate, your humidity levels, what media it's growing in. But your best bet is to make sure that it's well watered and then allow for that media then to dry out somewhat before rewatering. And often that's about 5 to 7 days before your media is dry enough that you should be watering again. Just use your pinky and put your pinky in to feel whether your media is dry enough that you should be rewatering. And how much light do these orchids need? A lot of people like to put them into dark rooms or dark corners because that's where they're going to look pretty up against the wall, but that's not what they're going to enjoy. They do like bright light. So perhaps an east-facing window that can get all of that glorious morning sun in through it, perhaps with a net curtain in front of it to get a bit of filtered light so that it's not getting direct sunlight, because the direct sunlight can burn the leaves, especially being such broad, fleshy leaves. And one of the ways you can tell that your orchid's not getting enough sunlight is if you have a deep, rich emerald green to your plant. It looks magnificent, but that just means it's trying to photosynthesize more. So bring it closer to the light source so it can get more light. Should I mist my orchid? Should you be spraying water across the top of the leaves of your plant in a light spray? Absolutely not. We don't want water then to drip down and fall into the crown or roll into the crown and those leaf crevices, and to keep moisture there all the time. That's going to start causing problems with rot. So if you're worried about misting, then you need to increase your humidity levels possibly, especially if your humidity levels are low. You're going to need to perhaps use evaporation trays or a humidifier to increase the humidity in the room that you're growing your orchids in. That way you're not going to have to mist the leaves, and that way you won't get excess runoff of water into the crown or those leaf axes. How should I be watering my orchid? What's going to be the best way to water this orchid? Often the best way to do it is by submerging it in a shallow bowl of water to allow the moisture to rise up through the pot. That way you can be ensuring that you're getting the entire media in the pot moist while doing so. Because if you're just pouring from one point in, then often the water can just run out, just moisten a small patch of your pot as it is, and the other parts are going to stay dry. So try and make sure when you're watering is to ensure that the entire media in your pot is going to become moist. And again, don't go watering your leaves, because we don't want that buildup of water in the leaf axes or in the crown. What temperature range is best for my Phalaenopsis? Phalaenopsis generally do pretty well indoors because they like much the same climate that we do. In the home environment, anything between 22 and 28 degrees Celsius during the day, and then they do like a little bit of a drop in temperature during the evenings. So about 18 to 20 degrees for your evening temperatures. So that's around day temperatures of 72 to about 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and your evening temperatures of around 60 to 65 degrees, and the evening temperatures around 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. But if you're struggling to get it bloom, there is a trick that you can use with your temperatures, but I'll get back to that just now when we start talking about blooming. And these guys really don't like to get cold. So keep them in that temperature range is going to be ideal for them. And here's the big question. Can I use ice cubes to water my orchids? We have done a very good video on this. Orchids love ice cubes that we'll link in the description box below. Be sure to check that out so you get the full details on why you should or should not be using ice cubes to water your Phalaenopsis. For a lot of people, this is a heated debate, so be sure to go check that out for all the details. Feeding and repotting. What fertilizer should I be using and how often? For Phalaenopsis, your best bet is going to be a well-balanced fertilizer. I generally use organic fertilizers and you feed them throughout the year. But as it gets into winter and if your temperatures do start cooling off, you can really reduce the quantities of your food quite dramatically. So during your growing season from spring and summer, even through autumn, you can feed it at dilute quantities of feed every week or every second week. But when I say you're giving dilute solutions, you're halving or even quartering the dose that you would be generally feeding your other houseplants. And then when it comes to that winter period, you're only going to be feeding them once a month. These guys don't go into dormancy like a lot of orchids, so you can keep feeding them throughout the year, but just reducing your quantities during that winter period. This is the same that you'll be doing for the watering as well, especially during that winter period. If you start getting cooler, remember, reduce your watering because your evaporation is going to be a lot slower and your pot and media will stay moist for longer. Remember, these guys don't have those large pseudobulbs like, for instance, your cattleyas or your cymbidiums that are going to store moisture. So these guys are still going to need to be kept moist to some degree right the way through the year so that they don't dehydrate. What type of potting media is best for my orchid? Well, Phalaenopsis like to have moisture all the time, as I've said. So if you are using an open media, sort of larger size bark pieces with charcoal and things, remember you're going to have to start watering more frequently. They do like quite a fine media that's going to help hold moisture for longer. So things like coir chunks, even bark with added sphagnum moss is also a good idea because that sphagnum moss helps hold moisture for longer, but the bark helps maintain air and drainage. Just using sphagnum moss, some people can manage it, but it is really difficult to control the amount of moisture in your pot all the time. And sphagnum moss can slowly compact and then it will start holding way too much water and that will rot your roots quickly. Depending on the quality of sphagnum moss, needs to be changed every year or every second year, whereas if you're using a bark media or some other media, you may need to repot your orchid much less frequently. And do Phalaenopsis need clear pots? Like these clear pots that you can see in and that allows the light in. A lot of people say that Phalaenopsis needs clear pots so that the roots can photosynthesize. But the only reason the roots are really going to photosynthesize is if your light conditions are too low, and then the roots are going to want to photosynthesize. But otherwise, you'll have enough leaf volume to do all the photosynthesis for you. And anyway, most people will take a clear pot and put it into a cover pot, and then your roots aren't getting light anyway. And here again, we've done a full video on this too. Go check that out on our homepage and you can search for clear pots. But before we move on, the one really nice thing about the clear pots is it allows you to see in. So this is going to allow you to see the status of your roots. It's going to allow you to see whether they're healthy, whether they're growing well, and whether they've got enough moisture. That's one of the bonus things about having these clear pots. It helps you observe your plant better so you can learn to manage it better. And then, how often or when should I repot? Phalaenopsis is all going to depend on, again, the media that you're using. Check that whether it's decomposing or whether it's compacting, and then you'll need to repot immediately, because we don't want it in a media that's going to hold too much moisture, because your roots are going to rot really quickly, and then you can land up with stem rot, and then your plant's pretty much done. So always watch your media to check that it hasn't started to decompose, and as soon as it has, it's time to repot. So often it's going to be every year, every second year, perhaps even less frequently if you're using more of an inorganic media, because these guys really don't need big pots all the time. Once they've grown to their full size, they're not really going to grow terribly much larger. So only repot when you see your media's decomposing, or you can see you're having problems with your roots. Should I trim the air roots or repot them into the media? Let me just grab one of the orchids that has air roots. There we go. When we're talking about air roots, it's these roots that shoot out and stick out over the top of the pot and out of the media into the air. Those are often labeled air roots or aerial roots. And these are grown like this and specifically adapted themselves to growing in the air and absorbing moisture out of the atmosphere. So they absorb moisture from the humidity levels in the air themselves. So if you are growing these aerial roots, remember to then check your pot, because perhaps your roots in your pot aren't doing so well. Perhaps it's gone anaerobic, there's not enough air movement going through, and it's holding too much moisture that your plant then wants to produce these aerial roots. But no, these really shouldn't be repotted into the pot, because it is very difficult for them to acclimatize now to a more moist, humid environment that they will then just rot in. And don't trim them off, because they're helping the plant survive. They're drawing in moisture and food from the environment and keeping your plant healthy. And before we get onto the health and problems, let's have a look at that flowering. Should I cut the flower spike when the flowers are all dead? So when these flowers start to fall off, should I be cutting this flower spike back? And if so, where should I cut it? Well, if the flower spike's still green, you can leave the whole flower spike on and only cut back as it starts to die off. That's if you want to get secondary flower spikes off the initial spike, like what's happened here. We had the initial spike up and then our secondary flower spikes coming off the sides. Otherwise, what you can do is, if you don't necessarily want the secondary flower spikes, because generally as the secondary flower spikes come, you get fewer flowers and generally smaller flowers than if you allowed it to rebloom from a new flower spike. So you can then go in and cut your flower spike off right at the base there near the stem of the orchid itself, and then allow in the new year for the new flower spike to come through at the next level up. Then you'll land up with more flowers and a bigger flowering display. How long do the flowers last? Phalaenopsis flowers can last 6 weeks if you're unlucky. Generally, you'll have a flower spike on your plant for about 3 months. And if you're really lucky or you're looking after your plant well, you can have that same flower spike in flower for up to 6 months or longer. So it all depends on the climate, how much humidity you have, how well you're looking after your plant, and also to some degree the genetics of the plant too, as to how long those flowers can last. But they are one of the longest lasting flowers that I know of. And if your aunt's got one that's in flower all year for the past 6 years, then it's a plastic one. Don't let her fool you. And how many times a year will they bloom? Generally, they'll only bloom once a year from those new flower spikes that come up from the base, especially if you're cutting back that flower spike after it's finished flowering to allow for a big strong spike to come again in the next season. But depending on how you're looking after them again, some of them can actually flower twice a year. So once you've got it to finish flowering, you've cut back those flower spikes, and then you put it through a whole process, and then you can get it to flower again. But it's not the easiest thing to manage, but it can be done. Otherwise, by cutting off your flower spike only as it's dying and allowing those secondary buds to form along the length, you can get that flower spike to stay in flower for longer by producing more blooms. So whether you can call that blooming more than once a year, or whether that's still that 1 year's worth of blooms. And where are we? We're getting lost again. Sorry. Do they need a rest period to rebloom? Well, Phalaenopsis don't go through a dormancy period like a lot of other orchids, and that's not what causes the flower spike to mature, or that's not what causes the plant to mature and then to form flower spikes. What happens with Phalaenopsis is usually they go through, if we start at the flowering period, they go through flowering, then they go through a growing period, then they go through a cooling period. This generally what needs to happen is they need to reach about 15 degrees Celsius during your nighttime temperatures. So they need a slightly bigger temperature change between your day and night temperatures to help really force that flowering. That's why they can be almost geared up to flower twice a year if you're controlling their temperatures, their feeding, and their growth, so that you can get that flowering to happen again quickly. So no, they don't need a rest period or a dormancy period, although sometimes it does help in producing stronger flower spikes. Remember that dormancy period, you're not going to stop watering completely, because remember there's no pseudobulbs to store any energy or moisture for them, so you still have to keep them moist so that they can keep growing or stay alive. So remember again, if your orchid isn't flowering, some of the tricks to ensure that you get it to flower is, for one, making sure that you're giving it enough light. That's going to be one of the most important ones. And two, ensure that it gets that little bit of a cool period to help initiate that flower spike. That little bit of a drop in temperatures where your day-night temperature changes is slightly larger, that can help force it to flower. But remember, don't really go below 15 degrees Celsius, because if you start pushing your orchid into temperatures that it doesn't like, the cold, it's going to start affecting its metabolism, it's going to cause problems with your leaf, it will cause malformations and distorted growth. Also, it might just die. Talking about death, let's go to that health and problems. So, why are my leaves turning yellow? We'll get to that last, I think. What does it mean if the roots look mushy or dry? Well, if the roots look mushy, then it's a fairly obvious thing. You've overwatered. The media's been holding water for too long and the roots have just rotted and gone mushy and squishy, and generally it's going to smell pretty bad. So at that point, remember, you have to repot immediately, because that rot can then set into your stem too. If your roots are looking dry, check your media. If your media is dry, then make sure that you're watering your plant enough. Increase the humidity levels using evaporation trays or humidifiers, and ensure that you're watering your plant more frequently. But remember, it's always easier for your plant to recover from dehydration than it is to recover from rot. So don't go overwatering it. Moral of the story. How do I save an orchid with no roots and no leaves? This is why we have this magic little contraption here. It can be done. This one had roots, but it had no leaves, and by using this little contraption to keep humidity levels up, we can get this to resprout, and it has just started. So as long as you're keeping your humidity levels up, you may need to treat your plant for whatever it was that caused those roots or leaves to fall off. If it was a fungus or something, you'll need to give it a fungicide spray, perhaps something with a ginger or a garlic tonic, just to give it a little bit of a boost, and then lay it in a high humidity area and then it's fingers crossed and hoping you get some reaction out of it. Check out our Phalaenopsis playlist on the homepage. You'll probably find a link to one of those videos too. What pests attack Phalaenopsis and how to treat them? Phalaenopsis, your main pests are probably going to be things like mealybug, aphids, occasionally scale, and spider mites. Those are probably going to be your 4 main pests that you'll get on Phalaenopsis. Scale is probably the most difficult to get rid of, really. Mealybug and aphid can be easy, just a little bit of horticultural soap or a strong spray of water, a little bit of garlic tonic can do the trick really easily. Spider mites, a little bit more difficult. Sometimes your garlic tonic is enough, but sometimes it's not. You may need to go for a neem oil or something that's going to help keep them away. And then those nasty scale, those are only going to get on if you aren't keeping an eye on your orchid properly. If you catch them when they're young, you can wipe them off quite easily with an isopropyl alcohol swab. But after a while, they do tend to become quite glued on, and then you may need to use a toothpick or something to scrape them off and then wipe them with that isopropyl alcohol. Also, by giving your plant a little bit of a spray with that isopropyl alcohol, not too much too often because you can start damaging your plant, but that can also help get rid of most of those pests too. Now we have the 2 big questions. Why are my flower buds shriveling and falling off before opening? And why are my leaves turning yellow? So let's do the buds first. Why do the buds fall off before they've opened? There's a few main causes for this, and they're mostly with regards to stress on the plant. So if you've moved your plant from one area to another, as the buds have started to form and the 2 climates are quite different. If it's suddenly moved into a darker spot with less humidity and it's cold, you'll probably land up dropping all those buds. Also, if there's cold or hot breezes from air conditioners or heaters blowing up against your plant, this can also cause those buds to drop off. So any of those like big changes in temperature or climate in and around your orchid can cause that bud burst. So managing your orchid at this time is going to be important to keep all those flowers. Why are my leaves turning yellow? If your leaves from the bottom of the plant are turning yellow and falling off, often that's nothing terribly much to worry about. It's just the older leaves that are falling off, because the leaves don't last on the plant for years and years and years. You may get 2 or 3 years out of them, but that's going to be the maximum, and the new leaves are replacing the older leaves. If your leaves are starting to yellow from the top, then you have to be more wary about what's happening. If your leaves are starting to yellow from the center of the top, check out that you aren't overwatering and that you have now caused crown rot in your plant, because that can start to cause that whole point to yellow and all your leaves die and kill your whole plant. So make sure you're not overwatering or watering from the top. Also, nutrient deficiencies can cause yellowing in your leaves, and those happen at different points depending on what nutrient it is. Also, we'll put a link to the video where we describe the different yellowing from different nutrients in the description box down below. Also, don't forget, you can check that up in that Buy Me a Coffee link too. And if I haven't answered all your questions, just drop them in the comments box below and I'll be sure to get back to you individually. And thank you for watching. If you found any of this information helpful, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and that notification bell, bing bong, to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.